The mobster who was never arrested, 50 crimes and 0 convictions. November 3, 1932, 2:17 a.m. The alley behind Murphy's Deli on the Lower East Side was darker than the inside of a coffin. Detective Frank Morrison pressed his back against the brick wall, his service revolver trembling in his hands as footsteps echoed through the narrow passage. He'd been chasing Anthony, the ghost, Benedetto for 3 months, through 14 crime scenes, past 11 dead bodies, and into this godforsaken maze of shadows and desperation. Morrison thought he finally had him cornered. He was wrong. What Morrison didn't know, what nobody in the NYPD understood, was that catching Anthony Benedetto wasn't just impossible, it was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. For the next 43 years, the ghost would dance through the justice system like a phantom, leaving behind a trail of 50 documented crimes and 0 convictions, becoming the most untouchable criminal in American history. The footsteps stopped. Morrison held his breath, sweat beading on his forehead despite the November cold. Then, from somewhere impossibly close, came a voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Detective Morrison," the voice said, and Morrison's blood turned to ice because the voice was coming from directly behind him. "You're looking a little lost." Morrison spun around, gun raised, but found nothing but empty air and the faint scent of expensive cologne. When he turned back toward the alley, Anthony Benedetto was standing 20 feet away, hands casually in his pockets, smiling like he was greeting an old friend at a Sunday picnic. "You've been following me for quite some time," Benedetto continued, his voice carrying the slight trace of an Italian accent that made every word sound like a caress. "I'm flattered, truly. But I think there's been a misunderstanding." Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. "Anthony Benedetto, you're under arrest for the murder of Tommy Rossini." Benedetto tilted his head slightly, his expression genuinely puzzled. "I'm sorry, detective, but I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is Father Antonio Benetti, and I was just finishing evening prayers at St. Patrick's Cathedral." Morrison blinked, confusion flooding his mind. The man in front of him was wearing a priest's collar, not the expensive suit he'd been chasing through the city. But it was the same face, the same voice, the same impossibly calm demeanor. "That's impossible," Morrison whispered. "I followed you here from the warehouse." Father Benetti smiled sadly. "My son, I've been in confession with Mrs. O'Malley for the past 2 hours. She's quite thorough with her sins, bless her soul. Perhaps you should speak with her if you doubt my word." By morning, Morrison would have 3 witnesses swearing that Father Antonio Benetti had indeed been at the cathedral all evening, along with church records showing he'd been conducting services there for the past 6 months. The real Anthony Benedetto seemed to have vanished into thin air, taking with him any hope of solving Tommy Rossini's murder. This was Anthony Benedetto's gift, his supernatural ability to be in 2 places at once, to be guilty and innocent simultaneously, to commit the perfect crime not once, not twice, but 50 times over the course of 4 decades. Born in Sicily in 1905 to a family of olive farmers, Antonio Benedetto, as he was christened, showed signs of his peculiar talents early. At age 7, he convinced his entire village that he'd been attending church while simultaneously helping his grandfather steal sheep from neighboring farms. At 12, he managed to be sitting in his school classroom taking exams while witnesses placed him 3 towns over, picking pockets at the market. By 15, young Antonio had mastered the art of the perfect alibi, not through luck or coincidence, but through a methodology so sophisticated it bordered on the supernatural. The key to Benedetto's success wasn't just preparation, though he prepared for everything with the obsessive detail of a master craftsman. It wasn't just his network of contacts, though he cultivated relationships like a gardener tending prize orchids. It wasn't even his natural charisma, though he could charm a snake into giving up its venom. The secret to Anthony Benedetto's untouchable status was something far more profound and terrifying. He understood human nature with the precision of a surgeon and the creativity of an artist. He could read people's desires, fears, and weaknesses like sheet music, then orchestrate their behavior to create his perfect symphony of reasonable doubt. Take the case of the Riverside Bank robbery in 1938. On March 15, exactly $47,000 disappeared from the bank's main vault during broad daylight. The security guard was found unconscious, the vault door standing open, and the money gone without a trace. Witnesses described a man matching Benedetto's description entering the bank just before closing time. The security guard, when he regained consciousness, identified Benedetto from a photograph with absolute certainty. The bank manager confirmed that the man had asked specific questions about the vault's security systems. 3 separate customers remembered his distinctive voice and mannerisms. It seemed like an open and shut case, until Detective Morrison and his team tried to build a timeline. At the exact moment of the robbery, Anthony Benedetto was having dinner with Judge Harrison Blackwell and his wife at the Ritz-Carlton, discussing a charitable donation to the judge's favorite orphanage. Not only were there photographs from the dinner, but Benedetto had somehow arranged for a newspaper reporter to interview him at the table about his philanthropic activities. The interview was published the next morning, complete with timestamps and multiple witnesses. But here's where Benedetto's genius revealed itself. The dinner wasn't just an alibi, it was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Judge Blackwell, it turned out, had been struggling with gambling debts that threatened to destroy his career and reputation. 3 weeks before the robbery, Benedetto had quietly paid off those debts through an intermediary, asking for nothing in return except perhaps the judge's friendship and conversation over dinner sometime. When the time came to provide an alibi, Judge Blackwell didn't just remember dining with Benedetto. He remembered feeling genuinely grateful to the man, grateful enough to stake his reputation on Benedetto's character. But the psychological manipulation went deeper. Mrs. Blackwell had been suffering from depression following the death of her daughter, and Benedetto had spent months positioning himself as a comfort to the grieving mother, sharing stories of his own fictional losses, recommending doctors, even arranging for flowers to be delivered on particularly difficult days. When she vouched for Benedetto's presence at dinner, she wasn't just providing an alibi, she was defending someone she genuinely cared about. The newspaper reporter had been struggling to make his mark in a competitive field, and Benedetto had been feeding him exclusive stories about charitable activities and community improvements, making the young man's career while simultaneously creating a network of positive publicity. When the reporter interviewed Benedetto at dinner, he wasn't just doing his job, he was spending time with his most reliable source, someone he trusted implicitly. This was Benedetto's true artistry. He didn't just create alibis, he created emotional investment. People didn't lie for Anthony Benedetto, they told the truth about a man who had genuinely helped them, cared for them, been present in their lives during crucial moments. The fact that this same man was simultaneously orchestrating elaborate crimes was a contradiction their minds simply couldn't process. So they didn't. They focused on what they knew to be true. Anthony Benedetto was a good man who had been kind to them when they needed kindness most. The bank robbery investigation collapsed within a week. Despite overwhelming evidence placing Benedetto at the scene, despite witness testimony and forensic evidence, the prosecutors couldn't overcome the simple fact that their suspect had been publicly dining with a respected judge while the crime occurred. But Morrison wasn't finished. He spent the next 6 months investigating every aspect of Benedetto's life, following money trails, interviewing associates, building a comprehensive picture of one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in American history. What he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his career. Benedetto's organization wasn't like traditional crime families. There was no hierarchy of loyalty enforced through fear and violence. Instead, Benedetto had created a network of hundreds of people who genuinely believed they were helping a philanthropist and community leader. The man who drove getaway cars thought he was providing transportation for charitable visits to orphanages. The woman who laundered money believed she was managing donations to worthy causes. The forgers creating false documents were convinced they were helping immigrants obtain necessary paperwork to start new lives. Each person in Benedetto's network knew only their small piece of the puzzle, and each piece appeared completely legitimate, even noble, when viewed in isolation. Take Maria Santos, a widow with 3 children who worked as a seamstress in Benedetto's employ. Maria believed she was altering costumes for theater productions that Benedetto sponsored as part of his cultural philanthropy. In reality, she was creating disguises for his various criminal enterprises. But Maria had no way of knowing this. She saw Benedetto visit local theaters, fund productions, and provide opportunities for struggling actors. When police questioned her about the clothing she'd altered, she spoke passionately about Benedetto's dedication to the arts, his generous support of creative endeavors, his kindness to her children when they were sick. The clothes she described making sounded like theatrical costumes because that's exactly what Benedetto had told her they were, complete with fictional play titles and character descriptions. Morrison realized he was dealing with something unprecedented in criminal history. Benedetto had created a legitimate business empire that functioned as camouflage for his illegal activities. His import business actually imported goods, his restaurants served real food to real customers, his charitable foundation funded actual charitable works. The legitimate activities weren't just cover stories. They were profitable enterprises that employed hundreds of people and generated substantial tax revenue for the city. When authorities investigated Benedetto's businesses, they found thriving, legally compliant operations staffed by people who genuinely believed in their employer's mission and character. By 1940, Morrison had documented Benedetto's involvement in 12 major crimes, from bank robberies to art theft to elaborate fraud schemes. Each crime bore Benedetto's signature attention to detail and psychological sophistication. Each investigation ended the same way, with witnesses providing unshakable alibis and prosecutors unable to overcome reasonable doubt. Morrison began to suspect that Benedetto was playing a game with the justice system, deliberately leaving enough evidence to be identified as a suspect while simultaneously making conviction impossible. This suspicion was confirmed during the infamous Westchester Museum heist of 1942. On the night of December 7, 3 priceless Renaissance paintings were stolen from the museum's main gallery. The theft was executed with precision that bordered on the artistic, with the thieves somehow bypassing multiple security systems and removing the paintings without triggering a single alarm. Museum guards reported seeing a man matching Benedetto's description studying the paintings earlier that week, asking detailed questions about their history and value. The man had provided identification showing him to be Dr. Anthony Benedetto, an art historian from Columbia University researching Italian Renaissance works for an upcoming exhibition. When police investigated, they discovered that Dr. Anthony Benedetto was indeed a respected art historian who had been researching Renaissance paintings for a Columbia University exhibition. They found his office at the university, his published papers on Italian art, his teaching schedule, and his students. They also found witnesses placing him at the university library until nearly midnight on the night of the theft, working on his research while surrounded by other scholars who could vouch for his presence. The identification he'd shown at the museum was genuine, issued by the university and verified through multiple databases. His questions about the paintings were consistent with legitimate academic research, and his knowledge of art history was extensive and authentic. But Morrison had learned to look deeper. He discovered that the real Dr. Anthony Benedetto had been recruited by the criminal Benedetto 2 years earlier, not through coercion or bribery, but through what appeared to be a genuine friendship. The criminal had attended the professor's lectures, engaged him in lengthy discussions about art and history, and eventually commissioned him to research specific artworks for what he claimed was a private collection. The professor had no idea that his research was being used to plan elaborate thefts. When the time came for the museum heist, the criminal Benedetto simply borrowed the professor's identity for a few hours, knowing that the professor's genuine presence at the university would provide an unbreakable alibi. This pattern repeated itself across dozens of cases. Benedetto would identify individuals whose lives and identities could serve his purposes, then spend months or even years building genuine relationships with these people, learning their habits, earning their trust, and positioning himself to briefly borrow aspects of their lives when needed. The stolen paintings from the Westchester Museum were never recovered, but 6 months after the theft, the museum received an anonymous donation of $100,000 specifically designated for improved security systems. The donation came with a note expressing the anonymous donor's concern for protecting cultural treasures for future generations. By 1945, Benedetto had become something of a legend in law enforcement circles. Police departments across the country shared stories of crimes bearing his signature style, elaborate schemes that combined traditional criminal techniques with unprecedented psychological manipulation. The FBI opened a file on him that would eventually grow to over 3,000 pages, documenting suspicious activities across 12 states, and linking him to crimes ranging from bank robbery to art theft to securities fraud. Yet for all their documentation, for all their witnesses and evidence, law enforcement agencies had never successfully prosecuted Benedetto for so much as a parking violation. Detective Morrison, now a captain, had made pursuing Benedetto his life's work. He'd studied every case, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and mapped out Benedetto's network of associates and businesses. Morrison understood better than anyone how Benedetto operated, but understanding and proving were two different things. In 1947, Morrison thought he'd finally found his breakthrough when Benedetto made what appeared to be his first significant mistake. The mistake came during the Great Brinks robbery preparation phase, when Benedetto was approached by a group of Boston criminals planning to rob the Brinks Armored Car Company's main depot. The Boston crew had heard of Benedetto's reputation and wanted his expertise in planning their ambitious heist. What they didn't know was that one of their number, Jimmy Murphy, was actually an undercover FBI agent who had spent 2 years infiltrating Boston's criminal underground. Murphy had recorded conversations, photographed meetings, and documented the entire planning process, including Benedetto's central role in developing the robbery's intricate details. The recordings were damning. Benedetto's voice could be heard discussing security systems, guard rotations, and escape routes. He provided detailed information about the Brinks building's layout, the company's cash handling procedures, and the best methods for disabling alarm systems. The FBI had finally captured Benedetto in the act of planning a major crime, with audio evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away through alibis and character witnesses. But when agents moved to arrest Benedetto, they discovered that the man they'd recorded wasn't Anthony Benedetto at all. The voice on the recordings belonged to his cousin, Angelo Benedetto, a legitimate security consultant who had been hired by the Boston criminals to assess their plan and point out potential flaws. Angelo had been conducting what he believed was a theoretical exercise, helping the group understand why their proposed robbery would fail so they could abandon the idea and pursue legal opportunities instead. Angelo had extensive documentation of his consulting business, client testimonials praising his efforts to steer potential criminals toward legitimate careers, and a reputation in law enforcement circles as someone who helped solve crimes rather than commit them. The recordings that seemed to capture Anthony Benedetto planning a robbery actually featured his cousin explaining why the robbery couldn't succeed and shouldn't be attempted. When transcripts were prepared for court, Angelo's words took on an entirely different meaning. His warnings about security systems sounded like advice for bypassing them. His descriptions of why the plan would fail read like instructions for making it succeed. The FBI had recorded a security expert trying to prevent a crime, but the context made it sound like a criminal mastermind planning one. Morrison realized that Anthony Benedetto had somehow orchestrated the entire situation, manipulating events so that his cousin would be in the right place at the right time to provide what appeared to be evidence of Benedetto's criminal planning while actually creating an unbreakable defense. The real Benedetto had been in Chicago during the recorded meetings, visiting his mother in the hospital and attending family gatherings with dozens of witnesses. Once again, he'd been guilty and innocent simultaneously, suspected of planning crimes while demonstrably caring for family members hundreds of miles away. The pattern continued through the 1950s as Benedetto's activities grew more sophisticated and his methods more refined. The Miracle Mile Art Gallery robberies of 1952 netted him 17 valuable paintings while he was visibly attending a charity auction across town. The First National Bank securities fraud of 1954 cost investors $200,000 while Benedetto was teaching Sunday school at St. Mary's Catholic Church, surrounded by dozens of parishioners who would later testify to his devotion and moral character. The diamond smuggling operation of 1956 moved millions of dollars worth of gems through New York's ports while Benedetto was recovering from appendicitis in Mount Sinai Hospital, his medical records documenting his presence in a hospital bed during every significant moment of the smuggling timeline. Each crime built upon the previous ones, refining techniques and expanding the network of unknowing accomplices. Benedetto's legitimate businesses had grown into a substantial empire employing over 1,000 people across multiple industries. His charitable foundation had become one of New York's largest, funding orphanages, hospitals, and educational programs throughout the city. His reputation as a philanthropist and community leader was unassailable, supported by decades of genuine good works and public service. Morrison understood that this reputation wasn't just camouflage for Benedetto's criminal activities. It was the foundation that made everything else possible. People couldn't believe that someone who had helped their children, funded their churches, and supported their communities could be the mastermind behind elaborate criminal enterprises. The cognitive dissonance was too great. When presented with evidence of Benedetto's crimes, witnesses didn't question the evidence. They questioned their own perceptions, assuming they must have been mistaken about what they'd seen or heard. This psychological dynamic reached its peak during the infamous Sutton Trust heist of 1958. The trust, which managed investments for some of New York's wealthiest families, lost $500,000 in a sophisticated scheme that involved forged documents, insider information, and precisely timed market manipulations. The scheme required intimate knowledge of the trust's operations, access to confidential client information, and the ability to execute complex financial transactions without triggering regulatory oversight. Every aspect of the plan pointed to someone with deep connections inside the financial industry and the sophistication to manipulate markets without detection. Investigators quickly focused on Benedetto, whose import business had recently begun offering investment services to clients and whose financial expertise had grown considerably over the previous decade. They found evidence of meetings between Benedetto and trust employees, documentation of his research into the trust's operations, and financial records suggesting unusual activity in accounts connected to his businesses. For the first time, prosecutors felt confident they could build a case that would finally bring Benedetto to justice. But when they dug deeper, investigators discovered that Benedetto's connection to the Sutton Trust wasn't criminal at all. He'd been hired by the Trust's board of directors to conduct a security assessment of their operations, specifically looking for vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sophisticated criminals. His meetings with employees were part of authorized research into the company's procedures. His access to confidential information had been granted by the Trust's leadership as part of his security evaluation. His unusual financial activity represented legitimate business transactions related to his expanded investment services. Most damaging to the prosecution's case, Benedetto had submitted a detailed report to the Trust's board 3 weeks before the heist, explicitly warning them about the exact vulnerabilities that were later exploited. The report outlined potential scenarios for insider trading, document forgery, and market manipulation, describing in precise detail how someone might steal exactly the amount that was eventually stolen through exactly the methods that were eventually used. The Trust's board had received Benedetto's warnings, acknowledged the risks he'd identified, but decided that implementing his recommended security improvements would be too expensive and disruptive to their operations. When the predicted heist occurred exactly as Benedetto had warned, it seemed to confirm his expertise as a security consultant rather than implicate him as a criminal. His detailed knowledge of the theft techniques appeared to come from professional analysis rather than criminal planning. His ability to predict the crime's methodology marked him as a prescient security expert rather than its architect. Once again, evidence that seemed to prove Benedetto's guilt actually demonstrated his innocence, leaving prosecutors with a case that seemed to build itself up before tearing itself down. Morrison had reached his breaking point. 30 years of investigation had produced thousands of pages of evidence, hundreds of witness statements, and dozens of cases that seemed to prove Benedetto's involvement in major crimes. Yet every investigation ended the same way, with evidence that seemed damning until examined closely, at which point it revealed itself to be perfectly innocent, often even praiseworthy. Morrison had begun to question his own sanity, wondering if he'd spent decades chasing shadows and seeing conspiracies where none existed. The answer came in 1962, during what would be Morrison's final investigation of Anthony Benedetto. The case involved the theft of $750,000 from a federal Treasury transport, a crime so audacious and technically sophisticated that it made headlines across the country. The thieves had intercepted the transport using what appeared to be official federal vehicles, presented authentic-looking documentation, and transferred the money using procedures that exactly matched actual Treasury protocols. The operation required insider knowledge of federal transport procedures, access to genuine Treasury documentation, and the ability to forge perfect replicas of federal identification and vehicles. Morrison's investigation led him through a maze of federal agencies, each of which had employed Benedetto in some consulting capacity over the previous 5 years. The Treasury Department had hired him to assess transport security procedures. The FBI had consulted with him on document forgery techniques used by international criminals. The Secret Service had brought him in to evaluate counterfeiting methods and their potential impact on currency security. In each case, Benedetto had provided valuable insights that helped improve federal security measures, earning praise and commendations from agency leadership. But Morrison noticed something that others had missed. Benedetto's consulting work with each agency had occurred in a specific sequence, with each assignment building upon knowledge gained from the previous one. His work with the Treasury Department had given him detailed knowledge of transport procedures. His FBI consultation had taught him advanced document forgery techniques. His Secret Service assignment had provided insight into federal identification systems and vehicle specifications. Taken individually, each consulting arrangement was legitimate and beneficial to the government. Taken together, they constituted a master class in planning and executing the perfect federal Treasury heist. Morrison realized he was looking at 40 years of methodical preparation, with every legitimate consulting assignment, every charitable endeavor, every business relationship serving multiple purposes simultaneously. Benedetto hadn't just been covering his crimes with good works. He'd been using his reputation for good works to gain access to the knowledge and resources needed for increasingly sophisticated crimes. His network of unknowing accomplices hadn't just provided alibis. They'd provided expertise, access, and credibility that made his criminal enterprises possible. The Treasury heist investigation revealed the full scope of Benedetto's methodology. He'd spent 5 years positioning himself as a valuable consultant to federal agencies, building relationships with key personnel, and gaining access to sensitive information about security procedures. When the time came to plan the heist, he didn't need to guess about transport routes or security measures. He'd helped design them. When he needed authentic documentation and vehicle specifications, he didn't need to steal them. He had legitimate access through his consulting work. When investigators looked for suspects with the knowledge and access necessary to plan such a sophisticated crime, they found Anthony Benedetto at the top of their list, but they also found extensive documentation of his authorized access to everything the crime required. Morrison's final report on the Benedetto investigation ran to over 400 pages and represented the culmination of 3 decades of law enforcement work. The report detailed 50 separate crimes that bore Benedetto's signature characteristics, documented his sophisticated network of legitimate businesses and charitable organizations, and mapped out the intricate web of relationships that made his criminal activities possible while simultaneously making prosecution impossible. Morrison concluded that Anthony Benedetto represented a new type of criminal, one who had evolved beyond traditional methods of operating outside the law to instead operate within it so skillfully that legal and illegal activities became indistinguishable. The report was classified immediately and distributed only to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Its conclusions were too disturbing to share publicly. Morrison had documented not just a criminal who had evaded justice, but a fundamental flaw in the justice system itself. Benedetto had shown that someone with sufficient intelligence, patience, and understanding of human psychology could commit virtually any crime while remaining untouchable by legal prosecution. He demonstrated that the very foundations of evidence-based justice could be manipulated by someone willing to invest decades in building the perfect cover story. Morrison retired in 1963, his career defined by his pursuit of a criminal who had never been convicted of anything. In his final interview, Morrison was asked whether he believed Benedetto was guilty of the crimes detailed in his classified report. Morrison's response became legendary among law enforcement professionals. "Anthony Benedetto is either the most prolific criminal in American history or the unluckiest man who ever lived. After 30 years of investigation, I honestly can't tell you which one is true, and that's exactly why he'll never see the inside of a prison cell." Anthony Benedetto died in 1975 at the age of 70, surrounded by family and friends who remembered him as a generous philanthropist, successful businessman, and pillar of his community. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he touched through his charitable work, his business activities, and his personal kindness. Judges, police officers, federal agents, and prosecutors were among the mourners, paying their respects to a man who had helped them professionally and personally over the decades. The mayor delivered a eulogy praising Benedetto's contributions to the city, and the Catholic Church granted him burial and consecrated ground based on his lifetime of charitable works and devotion to his faith. Morrison attended the funeral, watching from the back of the church as hundreds of people paid tribute to Anthony Benedetto's memory. After the service, Morrison stood at Benedetto's grave for nearly an hour, finally saying goodbye to the man who had defined his career and challenged his understanding of justice. When asked later what he thought about during that hour, Morrison replied, "I was wondering whether I was standing at the grave of a saint or a devil, and realizing that the answer probably doesn't matter anymore." The FBI's file on Anthony Benedetto remains classified, containing evidence of 50 crimes and 0 convictions, documenting one of the most sophisticated criminal careers in American history and one of law enforcement's most frustrating failures. Benedetto's legitimate businesses continued operating after his death, employing thousands of people and contributing millions to the economy. His charitable foundation still funds orphanages, hospitals, and educational programs throughout New York, touching thousands of lives every year with the generosity of a man who may or may not have been one of history's most successful criminals. Today, Anthony Benedetto is remembered as a businessman and philanthropist whose life exemplified the American dream of success through hard work and dedication to community service. Law enforcement professionals remember him differently, as the man who proved that the perfect crime isn't just possible, it's repeatable, sustainable, and ultimately undetectable when executed with sufficient sophistication and psychological insight. Whether he was a criminal mastermind or an incredibly unlucky legitimate businessman may never be known, but his legacy raises questions about the nature of justice, evidence, and truth that continue to challenge investigators and prosecutors today. The ghost of Anthony Benedetto haunts every unsolved case, every investigation that seems to have all the answers except the ability to prove them, every criminal who seems always to be one step ahead of the law. He represents the possibility that someone with enough intelligence, patience, and understanding of human nature can operate beyond the reach of justice not by breaking the system, but by understanding it so perfectly that they can use it against itself. In a world where evidence determines guilt or innocence, Anthony Benedetto proved that evidence itself can be the ultimate weapon, both sword and shield in the hands of someone skilled enough to wield it properly. His 50 crimes and 0 convictions stand as a testament to the limits of justice and the endless creativity of those who choose to test those limits.